2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Have you noticed that former President Trump is, how should we put this, ramping up the rhetoric and increasing his assault on the integrity of U.S. elections? Makes you wonder why. The race to the White House is in the final stretch, and no one can argue that the contest between Trump and Vice President Harris is close. Is he laying the groundwork just in case he loses? Just asking here. So comes on the heels of Trump being hit when the special counsel's indictment was unsealed. Jack Smith gave the most complete picture of his case so far in the federal election interference case from 2020. The ex-president pleaded not guilty, but the newest indictment paints a damning picture. Question is, in the end, will all that matter in Vote 2024? Republican voters seem willing to buy into the false narrative. So we have to see how it weighs on the minds of swing state voters. Now the challenges for Kamala Harris. The question for her is, will a couple of October surprises do anything to move what have been very close polling numbers? Those surprises include a very tense situation in the Middle East with the prospect of a regional war. And a major question, will the U.S. be drawn into that war? The White House is wrestling with that. Of course, there's the potential impact on the economy. If Israel and Iran do get into a fight, there could be an energy crisis and a major impact on gas prices. And there's another major issue with voters. Harris is losing support among a vital part of the Democratic base, Latinos and young people. Is the problem as bad as the polling numbers suggest? Welcome to Path to the Polls. I'm Bruce Hamilton, and joining me, government law attorney and former Jacksonville Chief of Staff, Chris Hand. Chris, thanks for being here. Do appreciate your time as always.
Good to see you, Bruce, as always.
And your insights, which we'll get into here. So, Chris, let's start with the lies the former president keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. And yes, they have been fact-checked. False claims like Harris can only win through cheating. During a speech in Michigan, Trump said, if I lose, I'll tell you what, it's possible because they cheat. That's the only way we're going to lose, because they cheat. Now, that's only one iteration of the lie. Look, facts first. It's nonsense. It's entirely possible Harris could legitimately win. It's only possible Trump wins legitimately. How could he possibly know? He has the votes he needs to win at this time. How could he possibly know, Chris?
Well, he doesn't, and of course we won't know until November the 5th, Election Day, and what has now sort of become Election Week, because of course, as we know, certain states don't start counting their early casted ballots until Election Day itself. So probably like 2020, maybe not quite as long, we will still have several days of counting after Election Day. But of course, nobody knows at this point what the results are. The only people who know are the voters when they go into the polls, whether that's by mail or early voting or on Election Day itself, and cast ballots. But this is something we've now seen in 3 straight elections from the former president. In 2016, you know, obviously when he was running against former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, he said that he wouldn't necessarily accept the results if he lost. In 2020, you outlined earlier in the show, obviously, what happened there with some of the election denial claims, of course, culminating in the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And already, former President Trump seems to be laying the groundwork for potential challenges to the election in the event that he is not successful. I think there's probably a variety of elements here, Bruce, you know, when we analyze why this is happening. One, probably an effort to somewhat cloud the picture. You know, as we know, President Trump repeatedly has run a campaign directed at his political base. And I think this strategy of raising questions and doubts about the election and about its integrity go directly to that sort of base direction strategy. It's also, this is someone who's repeatedly made it clear that he does not like to lose. Losing is not in his vocabulary. And so I think there's an element of that, sort of a psychological element to that as well. And then ultimately, you know, you wonder if it comes to be a situation where these things are said so often that one ultimately comes to believe them. Remember that the defining aspect of Trump's campaigns across these different years, starting with that escalator ride down in New York City in 2015, has been an attack on institutions and on the system, raising questions about whether the system is working for everyday Americans. And, you know, obviously there have been concerns, in many cases, understandable concerns on the part of the public about whether governmental institutions are working for them. These attacks are sort of, and these statements are sort of part and parcel of that overall strategy.
Does it worry you that we've gotten to this point in politics? I mean, if you look at history, go back to JFK and Richard Nixon. I mean, there were questions about the outcome of that race. Go back to, you know, Al Gore. They bowed out gracefully. We've never seen this kind of acrimony. We've never seen the country react like this.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, it is very worrisome for a variety of reasons. Our democracy works because of the idea that both winners and losers of elections accept the results and participate in a peaceful transfer of authority, whatever that transfer is, whether it's from one party to the same party or one party to another party. Our democracy has rested on that foundation. It's been something that has been consistent throughout American history, that we have respected election results. Obviously, the biggest break from that was in 2020, where, you know, following the results where Joe Biden won the election, the Trump campaign filed a large number of legal actions around the country trying to reverse the results. Those were sort of universally rejected. Obviously, the Electoral College then voted, and of course, we saw what happened on January 6th, where, you know, kind of a mob broke into the U.S. Capitol, you know, threatening the lives of people there. A very dark moment for American democracy. So it is a significant break. What I will tell you on the optimistic front is, Bruce, is that there were lessons learned from 2020, and there were some steps taken. One, for example, in 2022, Congress passed what's called the Electoral Count Reform Act to reform the federal statute that governs the counting of electoral votes. So now it's going to be much harder for members of Congress to object to the election results in any particular state. Makes very clear that the vice president's role is ministerial. Remember the great debate between then Vice President Mike Pence and former President Trump over this. There won't be any debate any further because it makes very clear what that role is. So there have been some steps taken to try and limit the possibility of something like a January 6th happening again. Still something that we have to be watchful for, because again, that fundamental bedrock of American democracy is the idea that we run spirited campaigns, people advocate for their candidates, candidates run hard, but at the end of the day, when there is a result, both sides respect that result, and we have a peaceful transfer of authority. That is a very important idea in American democracy, one that's important to uphold every election cycle.
Okay, no doubt. The things that are going to be said on this program, the things that I'm going to say here, are going to create a lot of controversy, and people are going to come at me. But the fact of the matter is that what I'm about to say is fact. Donald Trump lying is nothing new. According to the Washington Post, during his 4 years as president, he tendered 30,573 false or misleading claims. Why does this not resonate with the electorate?
I think for a number of reasons. One, as we sort of mentioned, I think, first of all, I think it does resonate with some parts of the electorate. Democratic voters are very sensitive to that, some independent voters, and even some Republican voters. Let's look at what Vice President Kamala Harris did, how she spent her day earlier this week. She spent it with former Republican member of Congress, Liz Cheney, whose father is former Vice President Dick Cheney, both of whom have endorsed the Vice President. And part of the reason they are campaigning for her is the idea that they are concerned about Donald Trump's sort of relationship with the truth and his kind of ability, that sort of mendacity that they accuse him of. So I think it is something that definitely parts of the electorate are sensitive about, and frankly why you're seeing Vice President Harris spend a good chunk of what's called her closing argument trying to help magnify some of the things he said, because I think there is a segment of the electorate that is sensitive to that. In terms of those who aren't, I think it could be a factor of a variety of things. One, remember that most Americans do not pay the kind of attention to politics, Bruce, that you and I do. They're busy with their own lives, they're dealing with their own challenges, seeking their own opportunities, so they're not in a position or have the time or inclination to do the sort of fact-checking that we who are sort of either in the media or media adjacent or involved with politics can
Or they
do.
don't trust the media.
Well, or that's true. As I say, I think that's another issue that, you know, again, part of the reason I think the former president has been successful is because there has been such a decline in the faith of various institutions in this country, whether that's government, whether that's the media, whether that's the financial infrastructure of this country. I think that has been in many ways the secret of Donald Trump's success, that very early on he knew there were great concerns about those institutions, a loss of trust in those institutions, and he's tried to position himself over time as someone who understands those concerns and is going to fight the institutions in which people have lost trust.
And look, I've said it before that there are factions of the journalistic institution who don't adhere to journalistic ethic. You know, what they do is they don't stay to the facts. They go ahead and they tender opinion and things like that, but that's a whole other issue. But when you have former staffers who work with Donald Trump, when you have General Milley calling him a fascist, I mean, that says a lot.
Well, to me, this sort of issue of kind of, you know, truth versus lies, honesty versus dishonesty goes to ultimately what is an elected official or candidate's responsibility to the voters or to the citizens they represent. I think there's a variety of responsibilities, but there are three that I think are very important. One is the responsibility to be available and accessible, to give citizens an opportunity to share their views, ask questions, be engaged in the process of government, not be walled off from them. Number two is a duty to listen, to understand that our democracy rests on a foundation where the people and the citizens are at the top of the organizational chart, and their views, their perspective, their concerns are very important and need to be given an audience for that. I think another one is the duty of candor. You know, one of the best known political figures in this country over the last 50 years, who very sadly died in 2018, was Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, Vietnam War, prisoner of war, military hero. And he always talked about how one of his most important principles in dealing with his constituents was a duty of candor. In fact, when he ran for president, both in 2000 and in 2008, you might recall, he had a town hall strategy where he did numerous town halls, particularly in New Hampshire, but in other states he visited as well, and really made an important bedrock principle of those town halls a duty to be candid. We saw that people would ask questions that he didn't like or thought were inappropriate. He would say so. Yeah, when, frankly, he was the Republican nominee in the fall of 2008 running against Barack Obama, he very famously had a town hall where a member of the town hall said something false about Senator Obama. He immediately corrected him.
He was from Kenya, and he says, no, ma'am, Barack Obama is he's an upstanding man. He's a U.S. citizen. Right, I remember that exchange.
I knew you were going to talk about that. With him, but he's a good man, he's a family man. That was a very famous moment for good reason in American politics because, again, not only did it show, I think, in that case, his character and someone who wanted to win the campaign on issues and not on other factors, but also what he felt was his duty to be candid with the American public. I think that's a duty that every candidate, every elected official has, and candidates who don't fulfill that duty, I think, are doing a disservice both to voters and to ultimately the citizens they represent.
And by the way, we're not saying that this is not to say that historically there aren't a lot of politicians who lie, not at all. But, you know, let's fact check some of the more recent falsehoods from former President Trump and other Republicans that have been repeating the false narrative that Democrats are purposefully letting migrants into the country so they vote. Look, there are severe penalties for non-citizens who try and vote illegally, and those penalties, they have been a deterrent.
Well, and frankly, one of the penalties for that is a non-citizen who attempts to vote will not become a citizen. And so this issue has been studied, you know, exhaustively, Bruce. It's been demonstrated not to be an issue where there are lots of non-citizens who are trying to vote. But again, it's a falsehood done for a couple of reasons. One, you know, obviously, former President Trump has made immigration sort of a key issue in his campaign. This sort of myth leans into that. It also leans into kind of, this has been a long-standing issue back to the days of the so-called Know-Nothing Party in the 1800s here in this country. So it sort of taps into that historical narrative as well. You know, I think all designed to kind of, again, an outreach strategy to his political base, also to help sort of cloud the narrative, create uncertainty. You know, when you've been involved, you know, we've either observed or been involved in a lot of campaigns, one strategy, admittedly a cynical strategy, but one strategy that I think a lot of campaigns have used at times is, I think, what is sort of colloquially known as the devil you know strategy, which is if you can create an atmosphere of distrust and lack of regard for all of the candidates, kind of lower the ceiling of the campaign, so to speak, that benefits some candidates more than others. I think to some extent we're seeing that strategy being used here in 2024, have seen it in other elections as well, and not just in the presidential election. This isn't just specific to the former president's campaign. We've seen it in numerous other campaigns over time. So again, I think part of this is strategic, part of it is just sort of tactical as well, seeing opportunities to help, again, sort of cloud the sort of political climate in the hopes that will produce some political advantage. Again, at the end of the day, though, that strays pretty far from the example and the mantra that John McCain followed when he was a candidate, which was to be candid with the voters.
Yeah, and I do have to wonder if it's his strategy and playing to the base. Over the weekend, blasted Kamala Harris about lying about working at McDonald's, yet he got a lot of publicity showing him at a McDonald's window serving fries. What's lost on a lot of people is that event was contrived. It didn't just happen organically. It was contrived. It was made up.
Well, and I think, again, part of the strategy we're seeing here is because Donald Trump has been sort of accused of dishonesty or found to be dishonest or lacking candor in a number of instances, part of the strategy here is for him to try and have his opponent seen in the same light. So part of the reason for the McDonald's event was so that he could call into question whether or not Kamala Harris had actually worked at McDonald's as she claimed when she was a a college student in California. She has repeated that she did. There's been eyewitnesses from the time who've said she did. But again, I think it's part of a strategy to try and bring both candidates into the same kind of standing, the same regard by voters.
Is that what's important to America? I don't mean to interrupt you. Is that what's important to America?
No, I think clearly it's not what's important to America, but that's why it's a political tactic to try and sort of shift the discussion and the dialogue from things that are important. Now, as we look at the issues in this campaign, there are issues that, that Americans clearly care about. For example, the Associated Press just did a poll earlier this week that showed that, as is the case with most elections, the economy is a major issue, immigration is a major issue. What's interesting and to me surprising about the Trump campaign is he has enjoyed advantages on those issues among the public for the better part of the last year. Obviously, Americans have been concerned about things like inflation, immigration has been an issue, and when you look at the candidates and who do voters regard more on those issues, they've tended to select him. What's been interesting about his campaign is that it has not leaned into those issues as much as one might think, given the advantages they have. As a result, some of those advantages have begun to disappear. For example, in this AP poll showed that more voters actually trust Vice President Harris on issues like jobs and unemployment and on issues like housing prices. And the difference between the two candidates on an issue of inflation, how they termed it was the price of groceries and gas, has basically kind of narrowed down to a tie. So that'll be important to watch over the next 2 weeks of the campaign. Has the Trump campaign missed an opportunity to really lean into those issues in a way, that might help ensure his reelection as president?
How about lying about his age at a rally in Pennsylvania? The lewd story about Arnold Palmer publicly denouncing Kamala Harris and saying she shows signs of cognitive deficit. Should a person who wants to be the most powerful person in the world be doing things like this, or is it calculated?
No, I think it is large. I mean, some of it may just be his personality and style. I think everyone's become accustomed to that over the last 8 or 9 years now. But I think there is sort of a calculated nature to it. Look, one of the questions that have been raised about him, because he's a candidate who is 78 years old, and she's a candidate who just turned 60 in the last couple of days, so a pretty big age difference there, is the same kind of questions that were raised about Joe Biden when he was a candidate. Are there cognitive issues or questions here? He's trying to turn that sort of back on her, also trying to sort of, deflect the age issue that he's been getting now that he is the much older candidate in the race as opposed to how it was before she became a candidate. So I think there is definitely a strategy to this, again, to try and sort of cloud the waters, try to make it sort of hard for voters to see distinctions between the two candidates on issues that might hurt him. So I think there's no question that's strategic.
And again, you're going to write to me about this, but my point is I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to find out, is this a strategy? What's going on? Let me talk about the January 6th riots. One of his aides came forward and said, Trump said, grab me a Diet Coke while I watch this on TV, and just the other day he calls it a love fest. Does that look like a love fest to you? It was an assault on the Capitol. Some would say an attempted coup. And if you look at the special counsel's most recent filing, it is downright damning. You're a government law attorney. Does the term love fest come to mind with a potential trial pending?
Well, I don't think anyone.
Does that make sense?
Well, I don't think anyone who watched January 6th, and I was actually sitting in this studio on January 6th and watched it live as it happened, I don't think anyone would use the word love to describe what happened there. That was a traumatizing event for the country in so many different ways. Traumatizing for our democracy, very traumatizing for members of Congress who were there either in the chambers or ultimately able to get out. Traumatizing for the former vice president. Traumatizing for the Capitol police officers, several of whom were either killed or severely injured during that onslaught.
While the president's sitting in his office drinking a Diet Coke, watching on TV.
The word love does not come to mind when talking about it. That was a day that did a lot of damage to this country. Like I said, Congress has moved since then to try and repair some of that with some reforms that would help to prevent that from happening again. But, look, I think this is not an uncommon psychological technique, Bruce, when the reality is not something of one's liking, trying to create an alternative reality that is more favorable to them politically. This is not the first time we've seen this. It's probably one of the more egregious examples of it. But again, these are efforts to sort of shift a narrative before Election Day. At the end of the day, what President Trump's campaign needs is enough voters to decide that whatever concerns they have about him, and you see this polling, he still has a net unfavorability rating in a lot of these polls, that their concerns about whether it's inflation or immigration or other issues are greater, that they can sort of find him palatable enough given their concerns about that issue. So that's, I think, a big effort, what the Trump campaign is trying to do, and appeal to particular groups. There's been a big focus on young men voters, particularly kind of low information, low propensity voters who are young men. I think a lot of this rhetoric is sort of directed there in an attempt to help sort of turn that group in Donald Trump's favor. So again, we do live in a little bit of a, kind of as in literature, this might be known in some as the upside down, where there are efforts to create an alternate reality from the actual reality in an effort to sort of cloud the waters. This is why it's so important. And again, our role here isn't to tell people who they should or shouldn't vote for.
Not at all.
But I think what is important for people to do is inform themselves. However they end up voting, I think it's crucial that people cast that ballot, whoever they cast it for, based on making an informed choice. So that's why I always encourage people, do things like go to the news4jax.com voter guide and really make sure you understand all the candidates and on the issues that are going to be on your ballot. Whether you're in North Florida, whether you're in South Georgia, make sure you know what's on the ballot, make sure you understand who the candidates or issues are, and make sure you understand what's at stake. If you go into the ballot box fully informed, having done that education, that is one of the most fundamental forms of effective citizenship, and I think is a way to make sure that you have my old boss and mentor, Bob Graham, used to say, the best way to fight bad facts is with good facts. It's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we are aware of good facts. So searching out sources that provide, facts, help to separate fact from fiction, and making sure we're fully informed when we go into the polls.
And I will say this unequivocally, I don't think either of the candidates has done a good enough job in telling us where they're going to take us with the economy, where they're going to take us when it comes to immigration, where they're going to take us when it comes to the situation in the Middle East. But, that's a whole nother story here, and it's too late in the game for that. You talked about what you think Donald Trump's end game is. Most of it plays to his political base. Is it going to play to the undecided voters? Is it going to play to those voters in the swing states who are going to matter in this election that's going to be very close?
Bruce, that is the $64,000 question of this campaign, because as what we've seen in this final stretch of the campaign, and 2 weeks from today as we sit here right now is Election Day, two very different approaches to kind of these potentially undecided voters. And let's talk about for a second, Bruce, who, as best we can tell, because it's not always super easy to tell this, who those undecided voters are. Well, they tend to be certain Republican voters, particularly Republican women voters in the swing states. You might recall that during the Republican primaries, even after Donald Trump clinched the nomination, there was still a pretty significant number of Republicans who were voting for former UN ambassador and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley as a protest vote of kinds against former President Trump. That is something that the Harris campaign is very keyed in on. It's why she's doing these events with Liz Cheney. It's why she's appearing with other Republicans, 100, former Republican presidential administration staffers, national security heads, people like Jeff Flake, who's a former U.S. Senator from Arizona. That's why you see the Harris campaign leaning into their Republican support to try and appeal to those probably former Nikki Haley voters who are still on the fence and maybe haven't fully decided. And then also with younger voters, that is a huge segment of the undecided electorate right now. People who are between the ages of 17 and 29, particularly diverse voters. There's a question about will they vote at all or who will they vote for. In some of the recent polling, CNBC just did a poll that showed that Kamala Harris had about a 60 to 40% lead among those voters, but of course that only matters if they actually show up to vote. So that's sort of the pool of undecided voters. The Harris campaign seems to be putting a lot of energy into both the kind of the Republican undecideds and trying to motivate these young voters out to the polls. The Trump campaign seems to be focusing a lot on these younger voters, particularly young men voters, trying to get them, again, I used the phrase earlier, low propensity voters. That just means voters who don't have a lot of history in showing up at the polls, but can make a difference if they do. Trump campaign focusing a lot of their attention on those low propensity young voters.
And there are a lot of black male voters who have been turned off by Kamala Harris. So let's talk more about Kamala Harris. When Path to the Polls continues, challenges for her. Call it the October surprise, turmoil in the Middle East, presents a number of potential problems. Also, the VP standing among a crucial segment of the electorate, which Chris was just talking about. Does she have the support of the Latino community and those young voters? Depends who you talk to. Chris and I explore those issues when Path to the Polls continues. Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton, along with government law attorney Chris Hand, an old hand at the political scene. All right, turn our focus to the Harris-Walz camp now. The first questions for her are, will a couple of October surprises do anything to move what have been very close polling numbers? Those surprises include a very tense situation in the Middle East with the prospect of a regional war. And a major question, will the U.S. be drawn into that war? White House is wrestling with that. And Chris, this is a major problem right now for the administration and for Harris. And look, the Israeli Prime Minister is basically doing his own thing, ignoring President Biden's advice. If things escalate, could that be problematic for the Harris camp? And right now, she is doing her best to distance herself from Joe Biden.
Well, I think there's no question that, that if there's suddenly a wider war in the Middle East, that, first of all, most importantly, poses, sort of peril to the region. And, we think about the people who are living there, but it can certainly have political consequences here as well, Bruce. I think one of the recent developments that may make that less of an issue in the 2 weeks remaining before the election day is, the Israelis were successful in killing the leader of Hamas. That seems to have changed the landscape there in the Middle East. I mean, there was some thought among the Biden administration that, that action might actually create some new opportunities for a ceasefire in Gaza. There was some talk earlier about Iran maybe retaliating and some efforts on their part to do that. That sort of ended up not becoming a more full-blown conflict. So certainly an issue we need to keep in mind and keep an eye on, because again, it's one that every candidate or every campaign is trying to put together a coalition. And while politics, as they used to say, should stop at the water's edge, sometimes these foreign issues can have major impacts on presidential campaigns. For the Harris campaign, one of the challenges has been trying to navigate the situation among supporters of Israel and, folks who are more critical of what Israel has done in the region. So that's been sort of a continuing challenge, both for the Biden administration and now for the Harris campaign. With this, the action that was taken against the former Hamas leader, that does seem to have, at least for the moment, maybe mitigated the possibility of a wider war in the Middle East, but certainly something we need to keep an eye on. And particularly in states like Michigan. I mean, the
big Muslim population.
A big Arab American population, where, there has been question about, are Arab American voters going to support the Harris campaign? They've traditionally been kind of Democratic voters, or will they either stay home or not vote altogether? Something we're ultimately not going to have the answer to until Election Day itself. Both campaigns are making efforts to shore up their support, both among supporters of Israel and in some of the Arab American communities. We really don't know how that will play out until Election Day itself. I think one of the things campaigns are often trying to do, and we see the Harris campaign trying to do this right now, is establishing multiple paths to victory. So, for example, just in Michigan alone, in addition to their efforts to reach out to a wide variety of voters, that's why you see things like the sit-downs, town halls she had with Liz Cheney, in an effort to try and, again, create some additional paths there, increase the number of kind of on-the-fence suburban voters or even Republican voters who might come to the ticket in the event they lose some voters who traditionally vote Democrat.
And I do think that there are a couple of wild cards here. Iran's bluster might be more than what it actually wants. I'm not sure that Iran really wants a war involving America. Number two, I'm not so sure that Antony Blinken will be successful in getting a ceasefire. He's in Tel Aviv right now. Number three, Benjamin Netanyahu. It is politically expedient right now for him to be the savior of Israel, so I'm not sure that he wants a ceasefire. And number four, who is Sinwar's successor with Hamas? That'll play a big role in what happens there. All right, let's turn the page a little bit to a key sector of the electorate. Harris is losing support among a vital part of the Democratic base. Latinos and young people, they make up a good part of the foundation for the Dems. And new surveys show that Harris has a dramatically smaller advantage among Latino voters nationwide than any other recent Democratic nominee. She's losing support among a vital part of that base. Latinos and young people make up a good part of that foundation. So some new surveys show that she has a dramatically smaller advantage among the Latino vote nationwide than any other recent Democratic nominee. Big problem for her?
Well, I actually want to point out, so there was a survey done, and as we were talking sort of off air, there's a lot of, which candidate is up and down right now in certain states or nationally. To me, the much more impactful and interesting polling right now is polling that's diving into a particular segment of the electorate. There was a poll that was released just yesterday, Bruce, of a group that surveyed 2,000 Latino voters across 6 of the 7 battleground states. And it actually found something really interesting, because the perception had certainly been what you just said, that Kamala Harris, that Joe Biden before her and Kamala Harris now had been losing support among Latino voters. What that poll said, and it's just one poll and just one snapshot in time, is that she had actually increased her lead among Latino voters just from the summer, up to almost 2/3 of Latino voters. Trump's numbers had also gone up a little bit to about sort of 31% among those voters as well. And as a result, showed her running a bit ahead of where Joe Biden was in 2020 among Latino voters. There'll be a variety of states where this will be sort of a key issue. Our state right here in Florida, of course, is one, the state of Texas, but also in those key swing states where there are, significant segments of the electorate that are Hispanic. There has been a perception that she's been running a little bit behind, but there is at least some recent polling that suggests that maybe that is not the case. Again, something that you're seeing both campaigns pour a ton of effort into appealing to Hispanic voters. Both have appeared in Univision town halls now. They're making direct appeals, having direct contact with Latino voters in those key swing states. So certainly a priority for both campaigns right now is appealing to, trying to persuade Latino voters to support either Vice President Harris or former President Trump.
Well, that poll we just showed Kamala Harris with a 14% deficit. And let me point out that the Univision town hall that Donald Trump took part in was stacked with Donald Trump supporters and Republican supporters. So now some political pundits counter and say the numbers that we just showed may not be as bad as they seem on the surface, which is your point. Steve Shire, who is a pundit, said the Latino survey is interesting. It has a low number of respondents, a high margin error, and Juan Pronano, the CEO of the League of United Latin American Citizens, went even further, saying the NBC poll has an extremely small immigrant sample and an extreme generation sample. It's mostly 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation acculturated Latinos. Something's very wrong. What do we believe here? Which is your point.
Well, I think the answer is we just don't know. Look, there's no question that in recent years, particularly the 2020 election, Joe Biden won a smaller percentage of Latinos than previous Democrats have done in the past. And, even in this state, Republicans have won higher percentages of Latino voters. For example, in the Senate race in 2018 between now Senator Rick Scott and former Senator Bill Nelson, that was a factor. There's no question about it. But I'm just saying there's some countervailing polling out there right now which suggests that she may be doing better among Latino voters, winning as many as 2/3 of them. And this was polling that looked directly at Latino voters in 6 of the 7 battleground states. So we really don't know. And I think the fact that both campaigns are spending so much time focused on and appealing to Latino voters certainly suggests that there is uncertainty there about which way some of those voters may break when it comes time to cast their ballots.
Now let's talk about young voters. For Democrats, a worrying trend that she is underwater among young voters in one of the closest swing states. That's also one of 3 bricks in the so-called blue wall, Wisconsin. The vice president's behind Trump when it comes to voters aged 18 to 29 in that Midwestern state, with just 40% of the support to Trump's 58%. This is from the New York Times Siena College poll of the state. She may not be alone in connecting with young voters. I was reading an article in Newsweek in which political consultant Jay Townsend was quoted as saying there is evidence in national polls that Harris will perform better among seniors than Biden did and less well among younger African Americans and Hispanic voters. Both candidates are having trouble connecting with young voters in this cycle.
Well, I think there's several aspects of younger voters. First, I mentioned earlier, there was another kind of recent CNBC poll of younger voters that suggested that she might have about a 60-40 lead with them. But again, those leads only matter, Bruce, obviously, if you can get voters to the poll to cast their ballots. And I think that's been one of the challenges with younger voters. They tend to be lower information voters. They generally, you know, much as you and I enjoy Path to the Polls and the other programming that WJXT does, they're probably not getting their information from these traditional media sources. They're getting them from other sources, or maybe not getting a lot of information at all. They've been through a pandemic. They've been through other tough situations. Their confidence and trust in government and politics has been eroded to a large extent. All of that has the impact of suppressing voter turnout. So I think there's going to be two questions when it comes to young voters. Not just who do they break for if they do vote, but will they go and vote? And I think that's why you're seeing both campaigns. We mentioned earlier, they are one of the key segments of remaining undecided voters out there. So both campaigns in different ways. The Donald Trump campaign appealing particularly to young men voters in an effort to try and get them to the polls on behalf of Donald Trump. The Harris-Walz campaign looking particularly at diverse younger voters, trying to make sure that African-American, Latino voters, women voters who might traditionally be thought of as part of a Democratic coalition come out for them on Election Day itself. So both campaigns have recognized that young voters are a key demographic in this election and are taking very different approaches to try and win over that group of voters.
I do have to say that I went out to early vote yesterday, and if I saw one or two people under the age of 35, it was a lot, and the same thing reflected in the stories that we did over the past couple of days when early voting began in Duval and today in Clay County. So we alluded to this earlier about who occupies the Oval Office at the end of election night. You think this contest is going to be protracted, drawn out before we have an answer?
Well, I don't think we have Election Day anymore. We have Election Week, right? And I think that is largely a function of the fact that Florida, of course, and some other states, they count their early votes and their absentee votes. They tabulate them as they come in. But some key swing states, predominantly Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, by state law, they are not allowed to start counting their early votes or their mail votes, whatever applies in those particular states, until 7 a.m. on Election Day. So as we saw in 2020, that can add some time to the count. It can take a while to count those. Now, there have been some progress and some improvements since 2020 in terms of some of the voting hardware they use to count ballots. I think it'll go much faster than it did in 2020. But barring a blowout one way or the other, and nothing we're seeing in the public opinion research is suggesting that's going to happen, we may not know the result on November the 5th. It may be November the 6th or November the 7th. After in 2020 was actually 4 or 5 days after Election Day. So we may not know on November 5th. We may not know until sometime in Election Week as opposed to Election Day.
And look, I've got to tell you, I've talked to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. I've talked to Jerry Holland. I've talked to other supervisors of election. They say that they are doing everything possible to guarantee that this election is fair. Chris, as always, I appreciate your time, your perspective,
thank you
and your
so much
insights.
for having me on the show.
And I invite you to write, if you'd like, to let me know your thoughts. All I ask is that you keep it on an even keel, and at the very least, that you can agree to disagree. An encore performance of this show on News4JAX Plus tonight at 7, or you can watch it on demand anytime on the News4JAX YouTube channel and news4jax.com. Like Chris said earlier, vote for whom you like. Vote for whom you agree with. Vote for those who you think will serve this country the best. We're not trying to, change your opinion about for whom you're going to vote. The most we want is for you to be an educated voter. That is our goal here. Hope you have a great day, and thank you for watching Path to the Polls.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.